What if they didn't pull away because you changed, but because you stopped needing them? What if the silence that unsettled them wasn't distance, but loss of control? What if the moment you stopped explaining yourself, something in them panicked? Because when you no longer need reassurance, when your calm no longer asks for permission, people don't feel rejected, they feel exposed. If you've ever noticed people growing colder when you stopped explaining yourself, if conversations shifted when you stopped seeking reassurance, if your calm suddenly made others tense, curious, or quietly hostile, this isn't coincidence, it's threat. Because most people don't fear confidence, they fear emotional self-sufficiency. The world is not governed by strength, it's governed by need. Who needs approval? Who needs reassurance? Who needs reaction to feel real? And the moment you stop needing, something fundamental breaks. You stop feeding the invisible economy that keeps relationships, workplaces, and social systems stable. You stop offering emotional access on demand. You stop leaking yourself outward so others can regulate themselves through you. And when that happens, people don't feel rejected. They feel unanchored. They can't read how much influence they still have. They can't calm themselves through your response. They can't position themselves safely around you. So they project, they speculate, they test. They label you distant, cold, arrogant, anything but what's actually happening, because admitting the truth would be unbearable. The truth is this: when you no longer need emotional supply, you exit the system that allows others to manage you. You become harder to steer, harder to pressure, harder to control. And history shows this pattern without exception. Those who require less become dangerous to systems built on dependence. This video is not here to comfort you. It's here to explain why the moment you stopped needing, you became a problem. If you've ever felt that shift, this is the law behind it.
Most people believe society is held together by shared values, mutual respect, or rational agreement. It isn't. It's held together by emotional dependence. From childhood, we are conditioned into an invisible system of regulation. Approval feels safe. Disapproval feels dangerous. Belonging is rewarded. Emotional deviation is corrected. Long before logic develops, the nervous system learns a rule it never forgets. Stay emotionally legible or risk exclusion. This is not morality. It's survival psychology. People regulate one another constantly through tone, reaction, reassurance, and responsiveness. They mirror emotions to maintain harmony. They reveal vulnerability to secure position. They react quickly to prove alignment. This isn't weakness. It's how most humans stay oriented inside groups. But this system has a critical flaw. It only works if everyone participates. The moment someone stops outsourcing their emotional stability, stops seeking reassurance, stops reacting on cue, stops explaining themselves into safety, they exit the emotional economy entirely. And that is destabilizing. Because now interaction no longer flows on predictable terms. The usual signals fail. The feedback loops collapse. Approval no longer regulates. Discomfort no longer corrects. The group can't reach that person the way it used to. This is why emotionally self-sufficient people are rarely confronted directly. Instead, they are reframed. First, they're called distant, then guarded, then arrogant, then hard to connect with. Not because they changed, but because they stopped leaking. Most people don't consciously experience this as loss of control. They experience it as something being off, something wrong, something cold. But what's actually happening is far more precise. Their emotional leverage stopped working. For most relationships, romantic, social, professional, connection is not built on truth first. It's built on exchange. Who reassures whom? Who needs whom more? Who regulates whose anxiety? These exchanges create hierarchy without anyone admitting it. When you remove your need, you remove your position in that hierarchy, and hierarchies do not dissolve peacefully. This is why emotional self-sufficiency feels antisocial even when it isn't. It removes the emotional handrails others rely on to feel secure. You are no longer predictable, no longer reactive, no longer easily placed. And predictability is how power flows quietly. Long before psychology gave this language, political theorists understood it instinctively. Control does not come from force first. It comes from expectation. If reactions are known, behavior can be managed. If emotions are readable, pressure can be applied. But emotional self-sufficiency blocks that entire mechanism. When you don't seek validation, approval loses leverage. When you don't react immediately, urgency collapses. When you don't explain yourself, narratives fail. And suddenly, others are forced into an unfamiliar position. They must regulate themselves. This is where discomfort turns into threat, because emotional dependence is rarely conscious. People don't experience it as reliance. They experience it as normal interaction. So when someone exits that system, it feels unnatural, wrong, even hostile. Not because the self-sufficient person is doing anything aggressive, but because they are no longer participating in emotional maintenance. And systems built on emotional maintenance do not tolerate non-participation well. This is the first fracture. In the next act, we'll go deeper into what happens psychologically when this fracture appears, why emotional self-sufficiency triggers fear, obsession, and loss of control in others, and why detachment is so often misread as dominance.
When emotional dependence is interrupted, the human mind does not respond calmly. It reacts defensively. This is because most people do not regulate themselves internally. They regulate relationally, through reaction, feedback, reassurance, and emotional exchange. When that exchange disappears, the nervous system loses its reference points. And when reference points disappear, the mind does not slow down. It accelerates. This is where fear begins. Psychologically, uncertainty is more threatening than rejection. Rejection has meaning. Silence does not. Predictability, even negative predictability, allows orientation. Emotional opacity does not. Research in cognitive psychology consistently shows that the brain treats ambiguity as danger. When intention cannot be read, the amygdala activates. This is why emotionally independent individuals provoke anxiety without doing anything overt. They don't argue. They don't withdraw dramatically. They don't assert superiority. They simply stop reacting on cue, and the mind spirals. What do they think of me? Did I do something wrong? Are they judging me? Do they see something I don't? These questions are not curiosity. They are attempts to restore control. When emotional feedback disappears, people don't feel rejected. They feel unoriented. And disorientation is intolerable. So the psyche looks for something to grab onto. This is where projection takes over. Carl Jung described this mechanism precisely. When the psyche cannot interpret the external object, it inserts its own unconscious material. The emotionally independent person becomes a psychological screen. Others project fears, motives, judgments, and hostility, none of which originated in that person. This is why emotionally self-contained individuals are often accused of traits they never displayed: cold, calculating, arrogant, unapproachable. These are not observations. They are defenses. They allow the observer to externalize discomfort rather than confront its source, their own dependence on emotional feedback. But projection doesn't always restore equilibrium. When it fails, obsession emerges. People replay conversations. They reread messages. They analyze pauses. They fixate on tone. They try to provoke reactions, not to attack, but to stabilize themselves. This is not hostility at first. It is regulation-seeking behavior. But when regulation fails repeatedly, fear hardens. Political psychologists have documented this in leadership dynamics. Groups become uneasy around individuals they cannot emotionally read, not because those individuals dominate, but because they cannot be steered. Influence normally flows through reassurance, approval, and reaction. When those channels close, leverage disappears. And when leverage disappears, effort reverses direction. Instead of the independent person adjusting to the room begins adjusting to them. People speak more carefully.
They hesitate before acting. They test less directly. They reveal more about themselves. The independent person does nothing to demand this shift. It happens because uncertainty reorganizes power. Long before psychology quantified it, Machiavelli observed this dynamic. Those who reveal themselves too quickly surrender advantage. Not because secrecy is cruel, but because predictability invites manipulation. The unreadable person cannot be positioned easily, and what cannot be positioned cannot be controlled. This is why emotionally independent individuals are often pressured to explain themselves. Why are you so quiet? Why don't you share more? Why don't you react like everyone else? These questions are not about understanding. They are attempts to reopen emotional access. Because once access is restored, leverage returns. But when access remains closed, not defensively, not theatrically, but calmly, fear deepens. And fear, left unresolved, turns into resentment. In the final act, we'll examine what happens when emotional independence stabilizes, how it transforms into authority, why others begin orienting around it, and why those who do not need emotional permission quietly gain control without ever seeking it.
There is a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when emotional independence stops creating friction and starts creating gravity. Nothing dramatic happens. No confrontation, no declaration, no visible power move. Yet everything in the room quietly reorganizes. Authority does not emerge from force. It emerges from non-need. Most people attempt influence by increasing output, talking more, reacting faster, explaining themselves, signaling alignment, proving competence. In doing so, they leak information constantly, emotional vulnerabilities, strategic intentions, psychological pressure points. The emotionally independent person leaks none of this, and in that absence, power accumulates. Social psychology confirms what ancient thinkers observed intuitively. Humans instinctively defer to those who do not seek validation, not because they admire them morally, but because the absence of need signals internal stability. The nervous system reads this as strength. This is why emotionally independent individuals are interrupted less, why their silence is waited on, why their words carry more weight when they finally speak. They are not louder, they are not more aggressive, they are simply unavailable for emotional negotiation. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this with brutal clarity. He argued that dependence places one beneath the object of dependence. The moment you require approval, reassurance, or reaction, you have already surrendered leverage. Emotional independence reverses that hierarchy instantly. You stop trading emotion for belonging. You stop explaining yourself into safety. You stop reacting to maintain relevance. And others feel it. Machiavelli recognized this dynamic long before modern psychology gave it language. He advised that those who reveal their intentions slowly force others to move first, and whoever moves first exposes position. Emotional independence creates this delay naturally. Others speak, you listen. Others reveal, you remain contained. Knowledge accumulates asymmetrically. This is authority without assertion. Kafka explored the darker consequence of this posture. Systems depend on legibility. They require explanation, compliance, emotional transparency. The person who does not provide these becomes difficult to process, and what cannot be processed becomes threatening. This is why emotionally independent individuals are often pressured to soften, to explain more, to react more, to reassure others into comfort. But true independence does not rush to comply, because once independence becomes internalized, it is no longer a tactic, it is identity. You are not withholding to control others, you are withholding because you no longer need to offer yourself indiscriminately. And this creates the final inversion. You no longer orient around rooms, rooms orient around you. You no longer seek influence, influence accumulates. You no longer manage perception, others manage their behavior. This is why emotionally independent people are often described as intimidating, even when they are calm, polite, and restrained. Their presence exposes dependence, and dependence
does not like to be seen. In the final word, we'll consolidate what this means, why emotional independence is rare, costly, and profoundly destabilizing, and why those who can sustain it quietly move through the world untouched.
If there is one truth beneath everything we've uncovered, it is this. Emotional independence is not rejected because it is cruel. It is rejected because it is inconvenient. It removes the emotional shortcuts people rely on to feel stable. It takes away shared excuses. It exposes how much of what we call connection is actually regulation, mutual reassurance, synchronized reactions, borrowed certainty. When you no longer need constant feedback, something irreversible happens. You stop negotiating your presence. You stop offering your inner world as currency. You stop leaking yourself outward to keep others comfortable. And the world feels that shift, not immediately, not consciously, but instinctively. People speak more carefully around you. They hesitate before projecting. They sense, without being able to explain it, that you cannot be easily moved, managed, or absorbed. This is the hidden cost of emotional independence. You will not be universally liked, but you will be internally ordered. Carl Jung warned that individuation would feel like exile before it felt like wholeness, because withdrawing your psychological center from the collective means standing alone, without buffers, without borrowed identity, without emotional scaffolding. Independence is not isolation, it is self-anchoring. It does not reject connection, it filters it. And what remains are relationships no longer built on dependency, regulation, or fear, but on intention. This is why emotionally independent people unsettle others, not because they are cold, not because they are superior, but because they prove, quietly, without argument, that it is possible to live without being managed. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. This is Psycript, where inner depth replaces noise, where sovereignty replaces approval, and where power begins not by taking more from the world, but by no longer needing it.